everybody. I'm Allison Stanger, Director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs at Middlebury College. And I'd like to welcome you to this special session of the International Studies Colloquium. This is our brown bag session. It's unlike us not to have food served, but we are responding to economic circumstances much like everyone else. But if you do have food with you, please feel free to eat it. And I will now turn the floor over to Professor Stan Sloan himself, world-recognized expert on the NATO alliance, our topic today, and he will introduce our distinguished guests. So please, Professor Sloan.
Thank you, Allison. It is a real pleasure to introduce Leo Michel, an old friend. A friend has been the definition for a long time. Old gets stronger as we go along through the years. But Leo has, before I met him, Leo served as an officer in the U.S. Navy. And when I met him, he was actually working as a journalist in Washington for a French newspaper. He then went on, and I'm probably going to skip a few things, to work on the Hill as a staffer for Congress. He then worked as an intelligence analyst at Central Intelligence Agency. He moved on into the policy world eventually and became director of NATO policy in the Pentagon in the late 90s and early 2000s. And since 2002, he has been working as a senior research fellow at the the Pentagon's think tank at National Defense University. The most important thing to know about Leo, beyond all of that, is that in my view, Leo is writing some of the most interesting, perceptive, and accurate things about French security policy and how that affects American interests, how that affects the NATO alliance. And so it's my real pleasure to introduce to you Leo Michel, who will talk about NATO, the United States, and France, a new ménage à trois. Leo.
Well, thank you very much. I will apologize if I cough a little bit. I'm still trying to get over a cold. And I'd also should begin with a disclaimer, and that is I am not really Leo Michel. And I'll explain that if you go into the French Google site, and if you Google Leo Michel, you will come up with a heavy metal rock guitarist who has posted some of his songs. Well, on a trip last year to France, a French colleague pointed this out to me. And so I sent the Google site to one of my daughters, who's a student actually at University of Vermont. And I said, this explains what I really do on these trips that I don't discuss very much with you when I go to France. What do you think? And obviously she listened to the link, and she sent me back a very brief response. She said, Dad, don't quit your day job, which is probably good advice. As my day job, as Stan mentioned, I work at the Institute for National Strategic Studies. We are like a think tank. We're located at National Defense University. I'm still a Department of Defense employee, if you will, so what I'm going to give you today are my personal opinions. But it's a very interesting position to be in. It's having one foot in and one foot out, where we still do internal work for Department of Defense and other U.S. agencies. But we also have an interesting role in facilitating kind of as a transmission belt, ideas between non-government research and academic institutions and our government connections, because it's important, if you want to have smart policy, not to just develop that in a government bubble. And then we have kind of a public outreach function as well, most of which actually I do in Europe and relatively little here in the United States. So it's a very nice opportunity, particularly to see Stan again and to come to an institution like Middlebury College. I don't come at this subject from an academic or, frankly, from a very theoretical perspective. I have worked on things either directly or indirectly related to France and European security, among other subjects, for about 30 years. And what I'm going to explain to you, or try to give you my perspective on is the perspective of a practitioner and someone whose ideas have evolved over time, but not as an academic who's simply, and this is not to be disrespectful to academics, but not only to give you the theory of how this relationship works, but also give you a feel, I hope, for some of the complexities of how things really work in the real political atmosphere that we live in. And I'll try to do a couple of things. I want to describe not too much about past history, but where I see the Euro-Atlantic relationship today, focus on two kind of key parts of it, the NATO alliance and also the developing role of the EU, and say, in fact, I will interject throughout all of this some specific comments about the French perspective. But once again, these are my own views. I would like to step back a little bit and say that despite many years of practical experience, I've learned never to underestimate the strength of myths that still are pervasive in parts of our own government, and I think pervasive in parts of the French government and political class. There are certain orthodoxies on both sides of the Atlantic that no matter how much experience we accumulate over time, these are still very strong. I'm not sure that they will determine policy today or in the future, but they still have a strong hold. If you take the American orthodoxy, as I've lived it, a little bit, not so much at CIA, but more within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where I worked for 17 years, there's a certain image of Europe and a certain image of France. And in fact, not just in the Pentagon, you'll find this in the State Department, other parts of the administration, other parts of the bureaucracy, and it really doesn't matter where it's a Democratic or Republican administration. And that orthodoxy goes a little bit like this, that NATO, created in 1949, you all generally know the history, is the anchor of the U.S. transatlantic relationship, at least with regard to defense and security matters. It's very important because the U.S. has a seat in the table. We have not a dictatorial role there, but we have a predominant role because of our political and our military capabilities. And it's very important because it's an alliance of sovereign countries. So at the beginning, 12 and now 26 countries sit around the table, and they have to hash things out. They do it in the end, under a consensus rule. You never vote in NATO. You simply, if you agree with a position, you simply remain silent. If you don't agree, you break silence, and then other people have to negotiate, and you negotiate to try to come up with a consensus. But people never raise hands in NATO. One country, however, if it breaks silence, can block that. And the U.S. has enjoyed, over the years, a predominant role. This is reflected in both the political structures and also in the military structures. And yes, we like this. We like this, A, because we think that it provides stability, it provides capabilities to the alliance that Europeans left to their own devices would not have. It does help our political weight in other areas as well, be they economic or financial. And frankly, we think that most of the Europeans like us there. And in the end, I think that's kind of true. That with all of the mistakes and perhaps overreaching that the U.S. makes, we've been pretty reliable over the past almost 60 years of the alliance. So the 60th anniversary is going to be celebrated this coming April. And for that reason, institutionally, it's kind of in our political DNA to be just a little bit skeptical, if not suspicious, of attempts over the years, not always, but often led by the French, to try to create some kind of alternative to NATO, which we view automatically as an alternative or a challenge to U.S. quote-unquote leadership of the alliance. In fact, and if you go back, I'll say a little bit about the history. This is not a phenomenon that started in 1966 with General de Gaulle when he pulled France out of the military wing of the alliance. If you go back to the early days of the alliance, even before de Gaulle became president in 1958, it was not very long before there was a strong undercurrent within the French military and more particularly within the political class thinking, this alliance where France should be one of the top three with the United States and the UK is too dominated by the Anglo-Saxons. They didn't really include Canada in that. They meant London and Washington. And those resentments actually built up over time. De Gaulle was the culmination for other reasons. And, if you will, the term that people generally say is he pulled France out of NATO. He did not. France never left NATO. It's a very important thing to remember. France left the military, the integrated military structures. NATO headquarters left for Paris, was moved to Brussels. But the real truth is that the ink was hardly dry on de Gaulle's speech, saying this is what's going to take place when the French military and the American military, under their NATO hat, was already negotiating and within a year had concluded secret arrangements to make sure that if there were an imminent military threat to the alliance from the Soviet Union, the French forces knew exactly where to go and what to do and how to coordinate with the United States. And since that time, that was in 1967, since that time there's been a gradual, slow, sometimes uneven movement by the French to very discreetly increase their practical day-to-day cooperation with NATO in the structures and later on, beginning in the 1990s, in operations. One last word about the U.S. orthodoxy. The U.S. orthodoxy had been, until relatively recently, not to say much about this. And we never said much about it publicly, basically because French officials told us, if you talk about this too much publicly, it'll make it harder at home for us to do the practical types of cooperation with NATO that we actually think are within our self-interest. The result of this has been general U.S. skepticism about France. Not to say that we have disrespected the capabilities of the French military, not to say that we've always been at odds with the French internationally, but their reserves within NATO, their one foot in, one foot out policy has put a chill over some of the broader strategic cooperation that we could do and are now doing with regard to Euro-Atlantic security. Now, let me shift gears. The French orthodoxy perception has been somewhat different. I already mentioned the fears in the beginning in the 1950s that NATO was really a U.S. or U.S.-UK dominated alliance, with concerns that that alliance then might work in ways that were detrimental to French security. There were French concerns. I don't really believe that they were legitimate, but French concerns raised in the early 60s that the U.S. would somehow drag France through NATO into support for our effort in Vietnam. In parentheses, it's very curious because in the early 1950s, one of the major French arguments within NATO is that as a NATO ally, we should be supporting their efforts in Indochina. Times change. But there have, beginning in the 70s, it accelerated a little bit in the 80s and 90s, another strain as France became more and more involved, more and more engaged with the European Union, began to develop the idea, well, particularly with the end of the Cold War, maybe a NATO-only European security structure is not really what we need. In the mid-90s, and I'm being very brief here in recounting the history, in the mid-90s you had something else. You had a series of wars, very bloody wars in the Balkans, where Europeans, or Europeans working under UN flag, could not really, on their own, stop the violence. They recognized this over time as their own failure. It was a failure of political will. It was also a failure, to a certain degree, in their military capabilities. And while they later supported and welcomed the fact that the U.S. administration, then President Clinton's administration, finally agreed to accept a prominent role, negotiating the Dayton agreements and so forth, and that the NATO force could actually come in as a peacekeeping force. It didn't impose peace, but it kept the peace there. The French participated in that, of course. It led to a certain, I would not say resentment, but a certain awakening, saying, well, is it time or isn't it time that Europe really should be able to take care of fires in its own backyard? Because here is a case where the United States hesitated, as we did. And so they really began to develop an argument, which I think was a valid argument, that Europe, as Europe, if NATO was not going to become involved, if the U.S. was hesitant for some reason, should have the capabilities to take care of its own continent. And this became perhaps the driving force for what happened in 1998, when you had, for the first time, the British switching position. Here, you come back to the importance of politics, and it's not exactly the theory, because the UK for years had resisted any French talk of having an EU defense dimension. But the British, too, under Prime Minister Blair, shifted their position in 1998, came to an agreement with the French that said the EU should have a security and defense dimension, and it should have the capability to act if NATO decided not to become involved. I was at the Pentagon. I mean, I became director of NATO policy at the time. It was after 1998, but it was when this movement of ESDP was really beginning to gain strength. And I can tell you that there were a lot of reservations. Not opposition, but reservations. There was, first of all, skepticism that Europeans really were ready to make the investment in capabilities and really were ready to act together to take care of fires in their own backyard, as I put it. It's actually an expression that I borrowed from the French defense minister at the time. There was also a certain natural reluctance to see the mechanism for transatlantic discussions or for European discussions of defense and security migrate from NATO, where we sit at the table, to the EU, where the U.S. doesn't sit at the table. A U.S. diplomat at EU basically has the same right to observe EU meetings as a member of the press corps. And we are not at the table. So a certain suspicion there that things could be done outside of our purview that might affect our interests, or might simply be a waste of money, duplication of structures, a waste of resources that the Europeans we knew were not spending enough. And this was countered by an argument really led by the French, but supported at the time by the British, that said, look, Americans, you've always complained that we're not ready to share the burden with you, or enough of the burden. We're telling you that we can do this, that under an EU banner, we can mobilize the resources and mobilize the political strength to do things that we can't do under NATO. You should be able to take yes for an answer. By the end of the Clinton administration, we had moved from open skepticism to actual support of this. The support, I will tell you, came from the Pentagon, came from Secretary Cohen, where he changed the tone, but he did it at the end of the administration when, frankly, it was too late. The new administration came in beginning of 2001. From the Republican administration, admittedly, there was much more skepticism of this idea of doing things outside of NATO. But once September 11th came, I'm telling you, the reaction, it was night and day. And ESDP, European defense, was simply not at the top of the radar screen. It was way back there behind what was then called the war on terrorism. We reached I would say, one more historical crisis in this relationship, which for many Americans in the administration at the time confirmed the perception that the EU was perhaps more of a threat than a benefit. That was in February of 2003, when there was an unprecedented split between the United States and some of its NATO allies. This was at a time when it wasn't absolutely clear, but it was pretty clear that there was going to be a war in Iraq. And 4 countries, France, Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg, would not hear of anything that would prejudice or perhaps even imply NATO support for that war, because they were opposed to it. In February of 2003, Turkey came to NATO, Turkey, an ally, and said, we're concerned about the defense of our territory if there's a war, that we could be subject to attacks. There are American bases on Turkey. Turkey at the time at least was considering our request to be used as an overflight and staging area. And they said, we'd like NATO to provide additional defensive assistance to Turkey. 4 countries, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, blocked even military planning in NATO to help another NATO ally, Turkey. This was unprecedented. The U.S., of course, looked upon this not only as a real attack on NATO, but as a demonstration that everything that they feared about having a separate EU defense policy, in particular led by the French, would be contrary to U.S. interests. I'll tell you one anecdote that circulated at the time. At the time, it was rumored that the Secretary General of NATO, who's Dutch, Jaap de Hoop, had a terrible nightmare, couldn't sleep, that NATO was going to fall apart under his watch, got out of bed, got on his knees, and prayed to God, and said, God, just tell me, is there ever a time where NATO will get its act together again and will be able to conduct major operations and have a spirit of consensus? And there was a long silence, and said, God apparently responded, yes, Jaap, but not in your lifetime. As the story goes, the same day, Javier Solana, who doesn't have the title, but he serves as the High Representative of the European Union, kind of their ersatz foreign minister, had the same type of dream, because the EU was also divided. The French had insulted all of the Eastern and Central Europeans, telling them they should shut up, and they weren't well educated. And Javier Solana got out of bed, got on his knees and prayed, said, God, is there ever a time where the EU can get its act together and do something useful in international security? And there was a long silence, and this time God responded, yes, Javier, but not in my lifetime. Well, the story is, and then I'm going to bring you up to the present, that things have improved a lot since then. Even despite the disagreements over Iraq, NATO came to a consensus in the summer of 2003 to assume what was previously simply a UN-mandated mission in Afghanistan, which is the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, and launched what has turned out to be its major and really most challenging expeditionary mission. Its real first combat mission, or ground combat mission. There was air combat, if you will, in Kosovo. And NATO, I'll mention some of the problems, has managed to, at least to now, to maintain a consensus and to maintain what is a very demanding effort on the alliance. The EU, by 2003, had already finished setting up its structures, which are very much parallel to NATO. There's a political structure for decision-making in NATO. You have the parallel structure, more or less, in the European Union. There's, of course, a military integrated command. That does not exist in the EU. It does exist in NATO, but the EU has a military staff that is able to do some planning of operations. And there's even now an EU defense agency that tries to coordinate and develop a more unified European view in terms of research, development, and eventually procurement of military things in ways that are not too dissimilar, at least in theory, if on a different scale of practice than what we do in NATO. And in fact now, the organizations, I'll mention some of the problems, have begun already to cooperate in ways that we did not foresee at the time. So with that bit of background, without using up too much of my time, I want to bring you up a little bit more now to looking ahead to some of the current challenges. And let me start first, even before I start with NATO, just mention that keep in mind that European public opinion, at least, in most of the countries, not all, but in most of the countries, of most of the NATO countries, favored the election of Barack Obama by overwhelming majorities. Overwhelming. It's stunning. At the same time, commentators on both sides of the Atlantic have already begun to ask, when is the honeymoon going to end? Because with this very popular, dynamic new president, new administration, an administration that's committed to a more multilateral approach to problems, and not, at least not an approach that's perceived as being overly militarized, also comes into office with expectations of whether or not Europe, under a kinder and gentler and more multilateral U.S. administration, is going to be willing to do more, at least in the terms of security and defense. And the host of problems out there is massive. Just in the past 6 months, you've seen Russia, which had already been flexing its economic and energy and intelligence arms in Central and Eastern Europe, unsheathed the military arm as well in Georgia. And you basically have, although the Russians have recognized him as independent, it's basically a unilateral changing of Georgia's borders. You have, through the arc of crisis in the Middle East, in addition to the recent Gaza conflict, still a very uncertain situation in Iraq, grave challenges in Afghanistan, not to mention the Iranian nuclear issue. Elsewhere in the world, you have continuing disasters where both U.S. and French interests are involved in parts of Africa. And as a background to all of this, of course, you have a financial meltdown. So you have enormous problems. But I think in all of this, what's interesting to observe is that if you read what French strategists have written, their strategy is not so different from the United States. But with regard to the United States, they also foresee that the United States will lose over time its preeminent situation in the world because of a resurgent China, for example, or a developing China, somewhat resurgent Russia. They see the United States as being more focused on the Middle East and on that arc of crisis. And the French now have kind of a two-pronged concern. Their old concern was that there would be too much America in Europe. I think broadly their concern has shifted to wondering, are we going to be able to maintain U.S. interest in Europe? And so their reasons for looking at a defense and security aspect of the EU have changed a little bit. It's not to replace the United States. It's to say we can't always be sure that we can rely on U.S. power. We're also not sure that U.S. values will always be the same as ours. And therefore, we want an alternative, but not an alternative that's exclusive of NATO, one that could cooperate with NATO. And that has been, over the past, I would argue, decade, a fundamental shift in the way the French see the situation. Let me just very quickly now tick off some of the strains for NATO. And I think in fairness, you have to begin with Afghanistan. because for many Americans, I participate and am invited to and participate in a lot of discussions, the off-the-record discussions that we hold in Washington with non-government think tanks. We include a lot of military, diplomatic officials, former senior officials. And there is a lot of questioning right now about, despite all of the good things that NATO has done, whether or not it really will have the resistance or the resilience in the long term to pursue a couple of important things. You're all familiar with the increasing level of violence, at least in parts of Afghanistan. And let me just point to a couple of problems that I think continue to really gnaw away at the solidarity of the alliance. One is an issue of, it's known in the jargon as caveats. When you have a NATO military operation, you actually have an operation set up by sovereign countries that decide by their own sovereign authorities how many troops they're going to contribute and what those troops are able to do. So you can have a multinational force, but you shouldn't confuse this with the image of a force where you have one general that gives orders and everyone follows those commands without reservations. Under caveats, you have some nations, not all, but some nations that say there are certain things that I will allow my troops to do, certain things they can't do. And I don't mean to pick on Germany, because Germany has made some very important contributions over the years. But it is an important, it's a real case that Germany, which for the past 4 years now has had the major responsibility for the northern region of Afghanistan, has caveats which are imposed by the Bundestag. So their parliament has imposed these as a condition of their mandate, which has to be approved every year or so, or renewed every year or so. That the German area of operation is only in that region, and German troops can only go outside the region for very specific and very short duration. And in fact, they have other operational things. In the end, what it means is that German forces, because of the weight of German public opinion, have been engaged in very, very few combat operations, because they sell it to their own public as this is peacekeeping. Where there are other parts of Afghanistan that, believe me, it is not peacekeeping, it is war. A war that the brunt of the effort has fallen on Americans, on Canadians, on Dutch, on British, and 2 or 3 of the smaller countries who, because they're small, don't give a lot of troops, but still get involved in some very hairy operations. The Danish are one example. And it's a concern among some allies that if they are in trouble and under stress in the South, that they look over their shoulder and say, where are our friends? And the other allies aren't coming through. France, last summer, France had participated with some special forces in some combat operations for a number of years, but it was a relatively low level. Last summer, a French battalion moved into eastern Afghanistan, to a region where they work very closely with Americans, and they've been involved in some heavy combat. And in fact, in August, they lost 10 soldiers. It was a national trauma in France. I was there shortly thereafter, and it's really affected them. But not all allies are engaged in that same level of operation, and that's a problem. One of the other major problems is that these operations cost a lot of money. NATO has a rule. It's that costs lie where they fall, meaning if you're France and you want to send your troops, contribute your troops to an operation in Afghanistan, fine, you're very welcome, but by the way, you pay for them. There's very, very little common funding within the NATO budget to help support operations. So there are some countries, some of the smaller allies, who are willing to send forces there. They would like to do more, but they simply can't afford to do so, and there's no NATO funding mechanism to enable to pay them for the equipment and the logistics and everything that it takes to support troops so many thousands of kilometers away. Very quickly with the NATO, there's another issue, and that is, and I mentioned Russia before, the Afghanistan operation has been going on now for a number of years. European publics generally, their support of that mission is wavering. More and more they're viewing it as somehow an American mission. Some have lost view of the original sense and the purpose of the mission. And with Russia's action in Georgia, there are a number of allies, particularly the Baltics, Poland, a couple of the Central Europeans, who are beginning to say, expeditionary operations, fine, we understand that, but we also have to be concerned about threats closer to home. And that's not that they expect tomorrow a Russian military invasion over the border. We all know that Russia is not the Soviet Union of the Cold War. But those actions that Russia has undertaken are threatening, and so you have some Europeans thinking over the long term that NATO, instead of focusing so far away, needs to focus on what we call its Article 5, which is the collective defense article of the treaty. And to do more training and to think of more capabilities that are oriented towards the territorial defense of Europe, not stabilization missions far away. So those are some of the strains that are pooling at NATO. We're going to have a test within the next few months. The administration has not announced the decision, but it's widely expected that President Obama will endorse the recommendation of some of the military leaders in the Pentagon, which is to increase the U.S. presence in Afghanistan by up to 30,000 troops over the next 18 months. This is approximately a doubling of the U.S. presence. Most of those troops, I understand, probably would go under the NATO operation, not the separate Operation Enduring Freedom. Well, for a number of years, Americans were criticized for not doing enough in Afghanistan. Now we're prepared to do even much more, and the question will be whether or not the European allies, not at the same level, but at some proportionate level, will as well be willing to send not just more troops, but more of also the civilian type of reconstruction assistance and training assistance that Afghanistan needs to become a more stable and over the long term, perhaps more democratic, but at least more stable, more responsive, more legitimate government. And I say that's a test because it's not certain. There are a number of reasons, I can go into them later if you would like, why there's hesitancy in Europe to do so. What happens then if more U.S. forces go in, and instead of encouraging a greater European effort, it's simply viewed as a European way to look for the exits? Let me switch to the EU. I gave you kind of a quick synopsis of what, at least in the idea of some French thinkers, this EU security and defense dimension would be. And that is an alternative, a capability to do things that would be a little bit different than NATO and on its own if the United States was not interested in participating through NATO. There was a notion, once again, it was influenced by the bad political relations that we had with the French in the early part of this 21st century. A perception that France was trying to make the EU a counterweight to the United States, to counterbalance us. I think that notion has been largely discredited. And to their credit, pretty much since the beginning of the Sarkozy government, but it's increased over time, more and more now the French not only say publicly, but act privately, which is even more important, as if they believe that NATO and the EU need to be complementary, that they have some different strengths that ought to be able to work together. The EU, yes, they will continue to push this kind of military dimensions, but the EU is more than that. And I think it's a good thing. The EU brings to the table, in situations like Kosovo and Afghanistan, It brings together civilian expertise, civilian capabilities in the form of police trainers, in the form of experts on law and order, on customs, to improve governance in Kosovo. And eventually, I hope to do the same in Afghanistan. When I was still in the Pentagon, when we thought of NATO-EU cooperation, to tell you the truth, we thought more in terms of dividing lines between the two. And that was a mistake. We set up agreements called the Berlin Plus agreements, whereby if NATO agreed, it could loan certain assets to the EU to conduct EU operations. And that's what we did in Bosnia. We thought of it this way. We thought of a tabula rasa. A crisis would arise somewhere. NATO might make a decision, perhaps in consultation with the EU. One or the other would become involved, and the other would pretty much stay out, perhaps with some assistance, perhaps not. And that was kind of the Bosnia model. But what we see in Kosovo and Afghanistan today is the two organizations are actually working together. Within Kosovo, the EU brings certain things forward. As I mentioned, police, customs agents, border training of all sorts to help the Kosovar government really set up its national institutions. And you still have a 16,000 man or so NATO military force for security purposes. Eventually, hopefully, that will decline over time. In Afghanistan, the weight of the burden is still carried by NATO, but it's still too small, still some problems with it. At least you have a few hundred EU police trainers now in Afghanistan. So they have to work with NATO. And there are some EU development organizations and development activities taking place as well. And I think really that's what the future is going to bring. It will bring more cooperation between the two. There are some practical impediments. And one is that you have not all members of NATO are members of the EU and vice versa. You've had a long-standing conflict between Turkey and Cyprus because you have a divided Cyprus. Turkey, a member of NATO that would like to become a member of the EU. And you have an EU member, Cyprus, which is not a member of NATO and which is not keen to see Turkey become a member of the EU. So within each organization, you have at least one country that somehow or sometimes tries to block cooperation with the other organization because they don't recognize the country. Turkey doesn't recognize Cyprus or the Cyprus government. Within all of this, I'm glad to see that the French attitude has changed. And it's changed in an important way. And France has, at least the president of France, has stated his intention to, in his words, to have France take its full place in NATO. He conditioned this upon having improvement within the European defense and security policy. France, just gave up ended its presidency of the EU. The EU, has a rotating 6-month presidency. I would not say it was a totally brilliant record, but they've done enough in terms of incremental steps to say credibly that they have strengthened European security and defense policy, which was one of their preconditions for reassuming their full place in NATO. Now we're waiting for the second act. I've written some papers on this. I'm happy to discuss this a little bit later if you're interested. But what this would involve over time would be France rejoining some of the military structures that where it's had a very, very small presence since a number of years. This is still going to be very politically difficult in France. There's still a lot of resistance, both on the right and the left. And I'll just tell you, and it's one of these ironies in France, that if you look at where France makes its major investments in terms of soldiers in operations, in terms of investments in headquarters personnel and in budgets over the years, its investments, its real investments in NATO far exceed what it's invested in the European Union. But you would never know this from the French political rhetoric where pride of place always goes to the EU. In the paper I wrote a few years ago, well, not a few years ago, it was just on the eve of Sarkozy's election, I set out at least the possibility for this evolution. And I described it as there's been a tug of war between de Gaulle and Descartes. And I thought eventually Cartesian logic would have the upper hand. And I think that's what's going to happen now. It won't be easy. It may not be always pretty. It's still going to be difficult for internal reasons in France. But I think we will get to a point where NATO and the EU actually are able to work in an interoperable, fairly cooperative way. Never forget that 21 of the allies are members of the EU. There are 27 EU members in total. Of the other 6, 5 are members of the Partnership for Peace, which cooperates very well, in most cases, with NATO. All of the countries, they have one defense budget. They have one Army, Navy, or Air Force. They can't teach them in separate ways to be NATO or EU or do national things. So I think the logic is there. It will also require a change in tone. I think for Americans, I should not be giving advice to the new administration, but my own personal view is that we may, over time, have to talk a little bit less about leadership, where we always hammer away the U.S. is the leader of the alliance, and use a tone that emphasizes more our partnership for Europeans. This also means giving them a little bit more space to do things on their own. And I think the French, in particular, will have to be a little bit more modest in some of their expectations and practical and pragmatic with regard to their expectations of the EU. I think in the end, the way I would sum it up has actually been summed up best by that famous expert on NATO-EU relations, who is Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. Because you'll always remember the song that he wrote about the NATO-EU relationship. And I think it was aimed at French and Americans, because the song says, you can't always get what you want, but if you try real hard, you just might get what you need. So thank you very much. Now, I've gone a little bit beyond my speaking time, but that's the risk you take when you give extemporaneous remarks. So I'd be happy if you have some clarifications or other questions, and however much time we have to respond to those. Sir.
In European U.S. attitudes, and that has to do with the ballistic missile
Sure.
defense. And I don't know that everyone here is familiar with that, but you could perhaps lay out the perspectives on that within Europe, the U.S., Russia, and what might we expect of the Obama administration, or what should we?
Yeah. You're right to say there are a variety of perspectives on it. From the U.S., a U.S. view, and then on one of my earlier positions at OSD, at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, this was part of my portfolio. That was some years ago. But I can tell you from the experience then that one of the, to use the French terms, one of the canards that have been out there, put out by some Russian officials, that we've never spoken to Russia about this, and all of this is a surprise to Russia. I mean, this is really far-fetched, because beginning in the early 90s, we had, with regard to theater missile defense, which is a limited defense, some very extensive and long-running exchanges and discussions with the Russians. We were not speaking at the time specifically of a site in Europe, but we were offering for a number of reasons, and in a number of ways, cooperation with Russia. Not just cooperation about this is what we have in mind, but actually down to the level of working on systems together. For a number of reasons, the Russians were interested in coming to the meetings, maybe just to learn what we were doing, but that cooperation never came to fruition. The rationale for having one site in Europe, and for those who think that the United States is trying to erect a Star Wars in Europe, it really isn't. And I'm not here as an apologist for the program, but just let me lay out the basic facts. The proposal, which has now been accepted at least by Poland and the Czech Republic, and there's nothing in place yet, but these things take time, is for the United States to install a site. It's about the size of 2 football fields, I think, that you would have in the ground 10 interceptors. These are 2-stage interceptors. They do not carry an explosive warhead. The idea is that the expression is to intercept a missile, a bullet with a bullet. It's basically a piece of metal at the tip of this. And the idea is that if there's an incoming missile, either aimed at Europe or overflying Europe towards the United States, that you would have at least the option of using these 10 kinetic kill missiles, they're called, or one of them, to intercept that missile and to destroy it in the outer atmosphere. Whether or not it's carrying a nuclear or chemical or biological warhead, you really wouldn't know, and to do with that. Associated with that would be a ground radar. It's a powerful radar, but actually a rather small one in the Czech Republic. And both governments, the Czech Republic and the Polish government, now have agreed to those basic arrangements. The rationale has absolutely nothing to do with Russia. Absolutely nothing. The real rationale has to do with Iran. We understand this. I actually believe the Russians understand that, and our allies within NATO understand that. Some of the NATO allies, not all of them, some are interested beyond Poland and the Czech Republic in participating in the system eventually, because it can be strengthened by having other sites, other radar sites, potentially other missiles, either offshore in the Mediterranean or perhaps in other sites in southeastern Europe. From a technical perspective, when you look at this, they have absolutely no capability against Russian strategic forces. They're too few, they're too slow, because Russian strategic forces, if you just look at the map, if they were to attack the United States, they would go over the pole. They're not going over Poland. The Russians understand this very well. They have no technical capability. I believe for Russia, it's all political. But because Russia has political concerns, this is a time where they view that the United States is putting military assets on the territory, frankly, of their former satellites, in a new, more kind of chauvinistic Russian view of the world. This is encirclement. This is somehow aimed at them. And so they've been very critical of it. Personally, I'll give you my personal belief, I think that missile defense is inevitable at some level. And I don't think of it as necessarily a perfect solution. I don't think there's any one perfect solution. I think we will continue to rely on conventional forces, on nuclear deterrence as well. But I think it's not a bad idea that the president have other options than to say, if there's an attack for whatever reason from a state like Iran, that it might be nice to have another option rather than say, okay, we're going to now launch a retaliatory strike and decimate I don't know how many Iranians. I think that's a very bad option. I think if you had a system that was reliable, that could help, first of all, deter an attack, and secondly, it gives you an option to say, we'll try defense first, so that then we can go back to diplomacy rather than immediately go to retaliation. France specifically is not, in the past they were somewhat critical of any missile defense because they viewed this as undercutting the viability of their own nuclear deterrent. Their thinking being that if you have a missile defense, then Russia will automatically increase its offensive forces and France will be more threatened, or that Russia might build more defenses and therefore the French could have less penetration. That's changed over the past couple of years, and I think the main French concern right now with missile defense is not the strategic rationale, it's what would France's role be, and because of restrictions on the French defense budget, they simply don't have the money right now to invest in defense systems. A very telling indication of where France is going is that in their recent White Book, which reforms their defense structure, you'll see that they're investing hundreds of millions of euros more in early warning systems for missile defense. Early warning, it's very important to have, but to have warning of a missile is not obviously enough. It normally is a prelude to having something that could intercept the missile. It's not that much use to know that you're going to be struck 5 or 10 minutes earlier or later. It is useful to know if you have these systems where the missiles are coming from so that you know who is responsible, A, and B, perhaps you can defend against it if you have a missile defense system. So I'm moderately, let's put this, I'm moderately in favor of your last question, where is the Obama administration going? The way I read the president-elect's statements, or the candidate Obama statements at the time, was that he's concerned with seeing that any system would be effective. And there are questions raised by very reasonable people in Congress of both parties as to whether or not the systems are yet technically mature enough that we should be investing them and putting them in bases. They take, project takes 2 or 3 years to actually put in place. And at least according to some of the unclassified intelligence community experts, by 2014, 2015, given their current rate of development, Iran could have an intermediate range missile of that range to hit Europe. So you can't just sit on your hands and wait, well, now we see the threat, and now in 6 months you'll build a missile defense system. Dr. Stinger.
It's a follow-up to the first one. The first one is, can you just explain for us the scenario that the Pentagon uses that explicate why on earth Iran would shoot a nuclear warhead at Europe or toward the United States, given the current configurations of strategic forces? What's the scenario that we're building this defense against? That's the first question.
Mm-hmm.
The second is, could you just tell us what I'm seeing increasingly in Pentagon publications, and you used in your remarks today the use of the term kinetic force.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and can you just explain
Well,
to us
sure.
what makes it kinetic?
Well, kinetic, as a general term, is used for anything that involves, in military parlance, anything that involves a physical strike against something. So it, from an M16 automatic rifle up to a missile, that is kinetic as opposed to use of information warfare or something like that. Kinetic, when it refers to a missile defense, refers to the fact that if you have, imagine an Iranian or some other missile that releases a warhead at a certain part in its arc, and you have a warhead coming in the outer atmosphere, you have a defensive missile that's launched, and that releases a warhead, which, as I said, is basically a piece of metal. There's no explosion to it. And it's the kinetic energy of that piece of metal that's traveling at such a high rate of speed that, in fact, hits an incoming warhead that might be carrying nuclear, chemical, and biological, and destroys it in the outer atmosphere. Now, there have been various simulations, only done on a simulation basis, that would show that even if there were some dispersal in the high atmosphere, of some nuclear material, that would be far better than the effects of a nuclear explosion at or near the surface of the Earth. With respect to scenarios, there are various scenarios that are used, but the basis for all of them is that we don't understand, as a nation, we don't understand how the Iranians view the use, either as a weapon or as a deterrent or as a political means of leverage, their nuclear weapon development program. And most people, and not just in the United States, are convinced that that's what the Iranians are after. And they are, and it's not my word, it's not the Pentagon's word, the Iranians brag about it, they are increasingly testing missiles of increasingly long range. They did one not very long ago, I think it was just about 2 months ago, that is a range of about, I think, 1,500 kilometers. So that's certainly enough to strike Israel, which they claim to be their main enemy. But at about 2,000 kilometers, you get into a whole arc that has Southeast Europe, and beyond that, in general, and I haven't seen the specific classified scenarios, but I think in general what I've seen would indicate that a scenario would be you have a crisis within the Middle East where the United States might, for one reason or another, either A, be tempted to launch a military strike, preemptive, whatever you want to call it, against their nuclear facilities, or B, try in some way to maintain open shipping in the Persian Gulf, because the Iranians from time to time have threatened to close it off, or taken some other action with regard to Israel, and the Iranians would say, no, you can't do that because you're threatening our national security interests, and in the end, we can hold you hostage as well. It sounds, on the face of it, like an irrational argument. But I'm not convinced, from what I've seen, that we as a government, including intelligence community and everyone else, because we've had so little contact with Iran, what gives us confidence that they would act in the same kind of responsible way that we learned to expect from the Soviets, or today from the Russians? And that's a big question. We don't know who controls. To the best of my knowledge, we don't know as a government really who controls the Iranian nuclear program. Is it the government per se? Is it the Revolutionary Guard? Is it part of the Revolutionary Guard? Is it all theoretical? It might be, except if you look not far away to Pakistan, you had a top scientist in Pakistan, A.Q. Khan, who, for a combination apparently of financial and ideological reasons, set up a network to sell Pakistani nuclear technology to the highest bidder, including North Korea, probably at one point including Libya, and perhaps others. Perhaps including Iran, who knows? And that gives people pause, that you could have a government that doesn't even have control over its own systems, and those things can link out in proliferating ways. We do, as a government, and we've always done this, we protect against a number of low probability but very high risk scenarios, and I think that's one of them. That a nuclear armed Iran with ballistic missiles that could carry them at significant distances would act perhaps in an irresponsible way. So this is another expensive, I'm sorry, but it will be expensive, but it's another expensive insurance policy.
Isn't a better insurance, I don't want to interrupt someone else, so please ask the question. I'm wondering if a better insurance policy would be this proposal for an international fuel bank.
Yeah.
That Warren Buffett has backed and the administration pledged money for.
To me, it sounds like a good option to be explored, but all of this depends on, ultimately, where is that? Because we have seen, and we've seen this in North Korea. Actually, we saw it before in Iraq, not to defend all of the actions that have been taken in Iraq. But you can have an international regime, but if something is on the territory of a sovereign state, and if it chooses at a certain moment to say, get out, we don't want the UN inspectors, we don't want the controls, but meanwhile we've developed the capability, we have the technology, and moreover we have the material, that has a certain element of risk to it. If the fuel bank were outside the country, you don't have that risk. But I believe, I can stand corrected on this, I believe that the Iranians themselves, publicly and on more than one occasion, have said they have a right to have the entire fuel enrichment cycle on their territory. They have the right to do it, so that's why they're going to do it. And of course, it's peaceful, just believe us, although there are a lot of reasons to be, at the least, suspicious. So,
I think we have one time for one student question.
Just on a
I'll try to make my answers more brief. I'm sorry.
Just on a completely different note here. I'm just wondering, in light of Berlin Plus, to what extent will France's full place in NATO bolster the military capabilities of the ESDP?
The full place, without getting too technical, because even, it's interesting, even in the French public, they never explain what it means. This is what it means. At NATO, you have 11 headquarters of different levels. Within these headquarters, you have some, perhaps about 100 or so flag officers, that's generals or admirals. You may have up to another 15,000 or so officers and non-commissioned officers. These headquarters do long-term strategic planning for operations. They do long-term strategic thinking and development of capabilities and operations. This is the real machinery of NATO, so that if there is a need to conduct an operation, the countries know how to, they have the same doctrine, more or less, they know how to operate together, and they have this, at least interoperable capabilities. You can argue that 15,000 is too large, and in fact it will be reduced, I'm sure, over the next year or so, but that's the real machinery. As an example, the United States has about 2,500 officers and non-commissioned officers in that machinery. France has 110. The Germans have 1,900, so the Germans think it's important. The British have over 1,000, the Italians have 1,000, the French have 110. The Germans hold 2 of the 4-star, that's the top-ranking military positions in NATO. The British hold 1 or 2. The Italians have 1. Americans right now hold 3 of the 7. My prediction is that we're going to give up 1 to make room for the French. But it's not just a question of generals. If the French come in and want to do their fair share, they're also going to have to bring in the staffers. And why is it in their interest? It's in their interest because everything that France does to improve the efficiency of NATO, its operations, its doctrine, its interoperability, its equipment, everything that they do to improve NATO will, in fact, improve ESDP, because it's all about Europeans working together as well. And the opposite is true as well. So.
I think Professor Krauss said it best when he said that you've done an excellent job explaining and talking about a number of complex issues in language that we all can relate to and understand. And I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking you for your presentation here today. Thank you, Leo.
Thank you.
Now for my class, we'll take a 5-minute break and then return here for